Guyana's history of colonization includes the following events. The Dutch were the first Europeans to settle there, starting in the early 17th century. They founded the colonies of Essequibo and Berbice, adding Demerara in the mid-18th century. In 1796, Great Britain took over these three colonies during hostilities with the French, who had occupied the Netherlands. Dutch colonization. The Dutch were the first Europeans to settle in Guyana in the early 17th century. They established armed bases and imported slaves from Africa to work on sugar plantations. British colonization. Britain gained control of Guyana during the Napoleonic Wars in 1814. The British united the three colonies of Demerara, Berbice, and Essequibo into one colony called British Guiana in 1831. Abolition of slavery. In 1834, Britain abolished slavery in Guyana. Many slaves left the plantations to establish their own free holdings and were replaced by indentured workers from India, Indonesia, China, and Portugal. Discovery of gold. In 1879, gold was discovered in Guyana, leading to an economic boom. Territorial dispute with Venezuela. In 1889, Venezuela claimed a large portion of Guyana west of the Essequibo River. An international arbitration tribunal ruled in favor of Guyana in 1899. Suspension of the Constitution. In 1953, Britain suspended Guyana's constitution, sent in troops, and installed an interim administration after a left-wing victory in democratic elections. Independence. Guyana became independent of the United Kingdom on May 26, 1966. It joined the Commonwealth and became a republic 4 years later. The name Guyana comes from an indigenous Amerindian language and means land of many waters. A chronology of key events. 1498 Christopher Columbus sights Guyana. 1580 Dutch established trading posts upriver. 1620 Dutch West India Company establishes a foothold in Guyana, including armed bases, and imports slaves from Africa to work on the sugar plantations. 1780-1813 Guyana changes hands several times between the Dutch, French and British. British rule. 1814 Britain occupies Guyana during the Napoleonic Wars. 1823 Major nonviolent slave rebellion crushed in Demerara. 1831 Guyana officially declared a British colony. 1834 Slavery abolished, many slaves leave plantations to set up their own free holdings and are replaced by indentured workers mainly from India. 1879 Gold is discovered in Guyana and is followed by an economic boom. 1889 Venezuela lays claim to a large portion of Guyana west of the Essequibo River. 1899 International Arbitration Tribunal rules in favor of Guyana, then called British Guiana, in the territorial dispute with Venezuela. British intervention. 1953 Britain suspends Guyana's constitution, sends in troops and installs an interim administration after democratic elections for parliament produces a result not to its liking, a victory for the left-wing Indo-Guyanese Progressive People's Party (PPP). 1957 Britain restores Guyanese constitution. PPP splits along racial lines, with Chetty Jagan leading a mostly Indian party and Forbes Burnham leading a party of African descendants, the People's National Congress (PNC). 1961 Guyana granted full autonomy, with Britain retaining control over internal and defense matters. Jagan of the PPP becomes Prime Minister. 1962 Venezuela revives its territorial claims on Guyana. Chetty Jagan introduces austerity program, sparking off violent riots and a general strike. British troops sent in to restore order. 1963 Racial violence between people of African origins and Indian supporters of Jagan. Independence. 1966 Guyana becomes independent with Forbes Burnham as Prime Minister. 1970 Guyana becomes a republic within the British Commonwealth with Raymond Arthur Chung as titular president. 1978 900 members of a religious sect commit mass suicide at Jonestown, a community established by sect leader Jim Jones. 1980 Guyana gets a new constitution and Burnham becomes the country's first executive president. Economic decline, elections. 1985 Desmond Hoyt PNC becomes president following the death of Burnham, economy begins to deteriorate. 1992 PPP wins first completely free parliamentary elections since independence, Chetty Jagan becomes president. 1997 Jagan dies and is replaced by his wife Janet after elections. 1998 Government declares state of emergency in Georgetown in response to violent riots amid allegations of discrimination by PPP against Afro-Guyanese. 1999 Bharat Jagdeo becomes president after Janet Jagan resigned for health reasons. 2000 long-running dispute with Suriname over the offshore border comes to a head when Suriname gunboats evict an oil exploration rig from the area. Guyana had approved the exploration. 2002 July, TV presenter Mark Benschop charged with treason. Court says he encouraged protest in which presidential complex was stormed by demonstrators who were complaining of discrimination against Afro-Guyanese. 2003 April, U.S. Embassy employee is kidnapped and released after a ransom is paid. The abduction is part of a wave of violent crime. The murder rate in 2002 quadrupled to more than 160. 2004 May, Home Affairs Minister Ronald Godroj steps down to allow an inquiry into allegations that he is linked to a death squad accused of executing hundreds of suspected criminals. 2004 June, UN sets up tribunal to try to resolve long-running maritime border dispute between Guyana and neighboring Suriname. 2004 December, jury at trial of TV presenter Mark Benschop, charged with treason in 2002, fails to deliver unanimous verdict necessitating retrial. 2005 January, government declares the capital a disaster zone as severe flooding follows days of continuous rain. More than 30 people are killed. UN estimates loss to the economy to be $500 million. 2005 April, Ronald Godroj reappointed as Interior Minister after inquiry clears him of direct involvement in killings of known and suspected criminals. He resigns in May. 2006 April, Agriculture Minister Satidio Sa is shot dead. The murder is part of a string of gun crimes. The ruling party says the killing is intended to incite pre-election violence. 2006 August, President Bharat Jagdeo wins another 5-year term in general elections. 2007 June, former Guyanese MP Abdul Qadir is arrested in Trinidad on suspicion of involvement in a plot of blow up New York's JFK airport. 2007 September, a UN tribunal rules in the Guyana-Suriname dispute over maritime territory, giving both a share of a potentially oil-rich offshore basin. 2008 July, President Bharat Jagdeo accuses the EU of using its economic might to bully developing nations into accepting its terms in negotiations with 16 Caribbean countries over a trade agreement. 2008 October, President Jagdeo signs trade agreement with EU. 2010 October, Parliament abolishes mandatory death penalty for murderers unless they have killed members of security forces. 2011 November, Donald Ramotar is elected as president. Ruling People's Progressive Party loses majority at parliamentary elections, but remains largest party. 2012 July, 3 die as police clash with demonstrators protesting against electricity price hikes. 2014 November, President Ramotar suspends opposition-dominated parliament just before it debates no confidence motion in his government. Opposition accuses him of undermining democracy. 2015 May, former senior army officer David Granger of the Afro-Guyanese Partnership for National Unity and Alliance for Change wins presidential election by slim margin, ending 23 years of rule by Indian-dominated People's Progressive Party. ExxonMobil announces significant oil discovery off Guyana in waters claimed by Venezuela, which repeats its claim. Guyana seeks UN mediation. 2018 December, coalition government loses parliamentary majority, raising possibility of early elections. A melting pot of cultures and a captivating maze of natural splendors, Guyana has been shaped by hundreds of years of tumultuous history. Considered one of South America's most hidden of gems, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana boasts a long-held and hard-fought history, having been used as a pawn of war and conquest ever since European arrival some 500 years ago. Tucked away in the northern frontiers and right on the cusp between South and Central America, it's understandable how this small and enigmatic nation has been sailing right under the tourist radar for so long. Roughly the size of Great Britain with only 770,000 inhabitants, Guyana attracts just a few thousand foreign tourists a year. If it's an off-the-beaten-path travel adventure you seek, then Guyana is it. Home to an impressive array of natural splendors, including one of the world's highest waterfalls, virgin rainforests and dramatic mountains home to elusive harpy eagles, Guyana is also one of the most culturally enriched nations in the entire continent. Influenced by the Spanish, the Dutch, the British and the French during the colonial conquest, and showcasing a stunning infusion of Caribbean and Asian flair, Guyana is as enticing for its man-made legacies as it is for its startling secretive beauty. Early colonizations, sugar, slavery and struggle. Although the Spanish were the first to set eyes on Guyana in 1499, the first permanent European colonies were established by the Dutch, initiating a tug-of-war between major powers which would not only shape this entire Caribbean region for the next 5 centuries but also create 3 separate modern-day countries, Guyana, French Guiana and Suriname. At the time of European arrival, Guyana had been inhabited by an array of indigenous nomadic tribes, including the Caribs, from where the term Caribbean originates, who survived on hunting and fishing. The harsh wilderness made it difficult for foreigners to flourish, hence the reason the initial Spanish and Portuguese settlements didn't survive for very long. The Dutch, backed by the Dutch West India Company, however, were a lot more successful. Not only did they establish the first colonies along the shores of the Berbice River, but they were able to ward off major challenges by the Brits and the French all through the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, only yielding small pockets of territories right throughout this period. The fertile lands and immense potential for the propagation of sugar plantations in the land were the main attractions for Europeans, and Guyana soon became the recipient of a mind-boggling number of slaves which the Dutch imported from their flourishing colonies in Africa and East India. The entire Caribbean region has been shaped by hundreds of years of slavery, with the infusion of African culture creating a totally unique identity here. Guyana, as well as French Guiana and Suriname, of course, are all perfect examples of this phenomenon. British rule and the abolishment of slavery. In 1814, the Dutch ceded 3 separate colonies to the British, and, in 1831, the 3 were united under one flag and renamed British Guiana. Dutch legislative and administrative systems remained, however, and the British, along with abolishing slavery in 1834, also created a cooperative whereby new plantation owners, some of whom were former slaves, were effectively represented by a governor. The massive opportunity for work enticed a new wave of indentured plantation workers from British colonies as far afield as India and Indonesia, as well as China and Portugal. This new wave of immigration further shaped the new country's immense cultural diversity, independence, and beyond. By 1961, British Guyana had achieved semi-autonomous rule and, by 1966, full independence from Great Britain. Interestingly enough, Great Britain was asked to help mediate between the 3 major upcoming political parties who couldn't, try as they may, compromise on the nitty-gritty details of what was to be their new constitution. The UK selected a type of proportional representation taking into consideration the new country's diverse ethnic groups, and this resulted in a new coalition government formed. Guyana joined the Commonwealth of Nations in 1966 and remains a member to this day. Internal strife and neighborhood disputes plagued the new country, with Venezuela claiming half of Ankoko Island and a slither of land along the Guyanese coast in the mid-1960s. By 1969, the central government had managed to quash a rebellion of its indigenous population on the Venezuelan border, highlighting what would become a persistent struggle by the Amerindians of Guyana to gain respect and representation in the new country. Guyanese of Indian and African descent make up the great majority of the population and, in turn, government representation. The Jonestown massacre puts Guyana under the international spotlight. Guyana came under international scrutiny due to a bizarre mass murder, suicide of a religious cult group set up by American sect leader Jim Jones. During the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War and a time of worldwide political tensions, Jones managed to convince his followers that the world would soon be destroyed by a nuclear war. Jones and 500 members of his congregation built Jonestown, aka the People's Temple Agricultural Project, in northern Guyana, a nation he heralded to be the new utopia. It was here, on the 18th of November 1978, that Jones and his 900-strong congregation committed suicide by poisoning. A decade-long dispute with Suriname over offshore drilling rights was finally settled in 2007, yet as new oil reserves were discovered off the Guyanese coast in 2016, the country is now currently in dispute with Venezuela over the rights to drill offshore. As a travel destination, Guyana is arguably one of Latin America's most rewarding. It is here that you can have startling highlights all to yourself, where you can soak up an atmosphere that's uniquely exotic, encounter rare and exceptional wildlife, enjoy many authentic cultural experiences in a truly eclectic journey, seamlessly combining cultural, historical and natural attractions into your itinerary. Guyana is the only country in South America which boasts English as its official language, although the most common lingo is a regional Creole dialect that's unique to the country. Given its incredible ethnic diversity, Guyana offers visitors a stunning array of gastronomic delights, including Indian roti and Asian stir-fries, alongside Caribbean specialities. Enticing and enigmatic, Guyana offers a unique travel experience in South America, one not marred, if you will, by an endless array of well-known guides, reviews and photo collections. Guyana is still a relatively undiscovered travel destination in Latin America, and for discerning, curious and interested travelers, that's a delectable lure indeed. The first known Europeans to encounter Guyana were Sir Walter Raleigh, an English explorer, and his crew. Raleigh published a book entitled The Discovery of Guyana, but this mainly relates to the Guyana region of Venezuela. The Dutch were the first Europeans to settle there, starting in the early 17th century. They founded the colonies of Essequibo and Berbice, adding Demerara in the mid-18th century. In 1796, Great Britain took over these 3 colonies during hostilities with the French, who had occupied the Netherlands. Britain returned control of the territory to the Batavian Republic in 1802, but captured the colonies a year later during the Napoleonic Wars. The Netherlands officially ceded the colonies to the United Kingdom in 1815. The British consolidated the territories into a single colony in 1831. The colony's capital was at Georgetown, known as Stabroek prior to 1812. Since the late 19th century, the economy has become more diversified but has still relied on resource exploitation. Guyana became independent of the United Kingdom on the 26th of May 1966. The English made at least 2 unsuccessful attempts in the 17th century to colonize the lands that would later be known as British Guiana. By that time, the Dutch had established 2 colonies in the area, Essequibo, administered by the Dutch West India Company, and Berbice, administered by the Berbice Association. The Dutch West India Company founded a 3rd colony, Demerara, in the mid-18th century. During the French Revolutionary Wars of the late 18th century, when the Netherlands were occupied by the French and Great Britain and France were at war, Britain took over the colony in 1796. A British expeditionary force was dispatched from its colony of Barbados to seize the colonies from the French-dominated Batavian Republic. The colonies surrendered without a struggle. Initially very little changed, as the British agreed to allow the long-established laws of the colonies to remain in force. In 1802, Britain returned the colonies to the Batavian Republic under the terms of the Treaty of Amiens. But after resuming hostilities with France in the Napoleonic Wars in 1803, Britain seized the colonies again less than a year later. The Netherlands officially ceded the 3 colonies to the United Kingdom in the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814. The UK continued separate administration of the individual colonies until 1822, when the administration of Essequibo and Demerara was combined. In 1831, the administration Essequibo, Demerara and Berbice was combined, and the united colony became known as British Guiana. During World War II, the United States Navy established NAF British Guiana and NAF Paramaribo in British Guiana. Economy and politics. The economy was based on cultivation and processing of sugarcane as a commodity crop, dependent on extensive labor by enslaved workers of mostly sub-Saharan African descent. Although the UK and the United States abolished the Atlantic slave trade in 1807, the domestic slave trade flourished until Britain emancipated all the enslaved in its colonies in the 1830s. The wealth they generated had largely flowed to a group of absentee slave owners living in Britain, especially in Glasgow and Liverpool. The economy of British Guiana was completely based on sugarcane production until the 1880s, when falling cane sugar prices stimulated a shift toward rice farming, mining and forestry. But the production of sugarcane remained a significant part of the economy. In 1959, sugar still accounted for nearly 50% of exports. Under the Dutch, settlement and economic activity was concentrated around sugarcane plantations lying inland from the coast. Under the British, cane planting expanded to richer coastal lands, with greater coastline protection. Until the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, sugar planters depended almost exclusively on slave labor to produce sugar. Georgetown was the site of a significant slave rebellion in 1823. In the 1880s, gold and diamond deposits were discovered in British Guiana, including what was thought to be the world's largest diamond in 1922. 5. They did not generate significant revenue. Bauxite deposits proved more promising and would remain an important part of the economy. The colony did not develop any significant manufacturing industry other than sugar factories, rice mills, sawmills, and certain small-scale industries including a brewery, a soap factory, a biscuit factory and an oxygen-acetylene plant, among others. The London-based Booker Group of companies, Booker Brothers, McConnell and Company, Limited, dominated the economy of British Guiana. The Bookers had owned sugar plantations in the colony since the early 19th century. By the end of the century they owned a majority of them. By 1950 they owned all but 3. With the increasing success and wealth of the Booker Group, they expanded internationally and diversified by investing in rum, pharmaceuticals, publishing, advertising, retail stores, timber, and petroleum, among other industries. The Booker Group became the largest employer in the colony, leading some to refer to it as Booker's Guiana. Indentured workers were recruited from India from 1850 to 1920 and were largely locked in place. A minority achieved mobility. Some secretly fled, others waited until their contracts expired. Indian migration within the colonies involved 3 phases: desertion from the plantations, movement settlements and later to urban areas, and intra-regional migration from one Caribbean island to another. The traditional rigid Indian caste system largely collapsed in the colonies. The colony made a small but important financial contribution to the war effort. It also served as a refuge for Jews displaced from continental Europe, where the Nazis and fascists worked to destroy them in the Holocaust. British colonists built the first railway system in British Guyana, 98 kilometers, 61 miles, of 1,435 millimeters, 4 feet 8 plus 1/2 in standard gauge, from Georgetown to Rossignol, and 31 kilometers, 19 miles, of 1,067 millimeters, 3 feet 6 in line between Vredenhoop and Parika. It opened in 1848. Several narrow gauge lines were built to serve the sugar industry, and others were built to serve the later bauxite and other mines. In 1948, when the railway in Bermuda was closed down, the locomotives, rolling stock, track, sleepers and virtually all the associated paraphernalia of a railway were shipped to British Guiana to renovate the aged system. The line ceased to operate in 1972. The large central station is still standing in Georgetown. Some of the inland mines still operate narrow gauge lines. The British long continued the forms of Dutch colonial government in British Guiana. A court of policy exercised both legislative and executive functions under the direction of the colonial governor, which existed from 1831 to 1966. A group known as the financial representatives sat with the court of policy in a combined court to set tax policies. A majority of the members of the courts was appointed by the governor, the rest were selected by a college of Keezers electors. The Keezers were elected with the restrictive franchise based on property holdings and limited to the larger landowners of the colony. The courts were dominated in the early centuries by the sugar planters and their representatives. In 1891, the College of Keezers was abolished in favor of direct election of the elective membership of the courts. Membership of the Court of Policy became half elected and half appointed, and all of the financial representatives became elective positions. The executive functions of the Court of Policy were transferred to a new executive council under the control of the governor. Property qualifications were significantly relaxed for voters and for candidates to the courts. In 1928, the British government abolished the Dutch-influenced constitution and replaced it with a Crown Colony constitution. A legislative council with an appointed majority was established, and the administrative powers of the governor were strengthened. These constitutional changes were not popular among the Guyanese, who viewed them as a step backward. The franchise was extended to women. In 1938, the West India Royal Commission, the Moyne Commission, was appointed to investigate the economic and social condition of all the British colonies in the Caribbean region after a number of civil and labor disturbances. Among other changes, the commission recommended some constitutional reforms. As a result, in 1943 a majority of the legislative council seats became elective. The property qualifications for voters and for candidates for the council were lowered, and the bar on women and clergy serving on the council was abolished. The governor retained control of the executive council, which had the power to veto or pass laws against wishes of the legislative council. The next round of constitutional reforms came in 1953. A bicameral legislature, consisting of a lower house of assembly and an upper state council, was established. The voting membership of the House of Assembly was entirely elective. The membership of the state council was appointed by the governor in the House of Assembly and possessed limited revisionary powers. A court of policy became the executive body, consisting of the governor and other colonial officials. Universal adult suffrage was instituted, and the property qualifications for office abolished. The election of the 27th of April 1953 under the new system provoked a serious constitutional crisis. The People's Progressive Party, PPP, won 18 of the 24 seats in the House of Assembly. This result alarmed the British government, which was surprised by the strong showing of the PPP. It considered the PPP as too friendly with communist organizations. As a result of its fears of communist influence in the colony, the British government suspended the constitution, declared a state of emergency, and militarily occupied British Guiana on the 9th of October 1953. Under the direction of the British Colonial Office, the governor assumed direct rule of the colony under an interim government which continued until 1957. On the 12th of August 1957, elections were held and the PPP won 9 of 14 elective seats in a new legislature. A constitutional convention convened in London in March 1960 reached agreement on another new legislature, to consist of an elected House of Assembly 35 seats and a nominated Senate 13 seats. In the ensuing election of the 21st of August 1961, the PPP won 20 seats in the House of Assembly, entitling it as the majority party to appoint 8 senators. Upon the 1961 election, British Guiana also became self-governing, except as to defense and external matters. The leader of the majority party became Prime Minister, who then named a Council of Ministers, replacing the former Executive Council. From 1962 to 1964, riots, strikes and other disturbances stemming from racial, social and economic conflicts delayed full independence for British Guiana. The leaders of the political parties reported to the British Colonial Secretary that they were unable to reach agreement on the remaining details of forming an independent government. The British Colonial Office intervened by imposing its own independence plan, in part requiring another election under a new proportional representation system. Britain expected that this system would reduce the number of seats won by the PPP and prevent it from obtaining a majority. The December 1964 elections for the new legislature gave the PPP 45.8%, 24 seats, the People's National Congress (PNC) 40.5%, 22 seats, and the United Force (UF) 12.4%, 7 seats. The UF agreed to form a coalition government with the PNC, and accordingly, the PNC leader became the new prime minister. In November 1965, an independence conference in London quickly reached agreement on an independent constitution. It set the date for independence as the 26th of May 1966. On that date, at 12 midnight, British Guyana became the new nation of Guyana. Guyana-Venezuela territorial dispute. In 1840, the British government assigned the German-born explorer Robert Hermann Schomburg to survey and mark out the western boundary of British Guyana with newly independent Venezuela. Venezuela did not accept the Schomburg Line, which placed the entire Cuyuni River basin within the colony. Venezuela claimed all lands west of the Essequibo River as its territory. The dispute continued on and off for half a century, culminating in the Venezuela Crisis of 1895, in which Venezuela sought to use the United States Monroe Doctrine to win support for its position. U.S. President Grover Cleveland used diplomatic pressure to get the British to agree to arbitration of the issue, ultimately agreeing terms for the arbitration that suited Britain. An arbitration tribunal convened in Paris in 1898 and issued its award in 1899. The tribunal awarded about 94% of the disputed territory to British Guyana. A commission surveyed a new border according to the award, and the parties accepted the boundary in 1905. There the matter rested until 1962, when Venezuela renewed its 19th-century claim, alleging that the arbitral award was invalid. After his death, Severo Mallet-Prevost, legal counsel for Venezuela and a named partner in the New York law firm Curtis Mallet-Prevost Colton Mosley, published a letter alleging that the judges on the tribunal acted improperly as a result of a backroom deal between Russia and Great Britain. The British government rejected this claim, asserting the validity of the 1899 award. The British Guyana government, then under the leadership of the PPP, also strongly rejected this claim. Efforts by all parties to resolve the matter on the eve of Guyana's independence in 1966 failed. As of today, the dispute remains unresolved. Eastern boundary with Suriname. Robert Schomburg's 1840 commission also included a survey of the colony's eastern boundary with the Dutch colony of Suriname, now the independent nation of Suriname. The 1899 arbitration award settling the British Guyana-Venezuela border made reference to the border with Suriname as continuing to the source of the Corentyne River, which it named as the Koutari River. The Netherlands raised a diplomatic protest, claiming that the new river, and not the Koutari, was to be regarded as the source of the Corentyne in the boundary. The British government in 1900 replied that the issue was already settled by the long-standing acceptance of the Koutari as the boundary. In 1962, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, on behalf of its then constituent country of Suriname, finally made formal claim to the New River Triangle, the triangular-shaped region between the New and Koutari rivers that was in dispute. The then Surinamese colonial government and, after 1975, the independent Surinamese government maintained the Dutch position, while the British Guyana government and later the independent Guyanese government maintained the British position.
If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more content, and leave a comment below. See you next time.